exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, do you want me to start? But any time? Okay. Time-wise. Okay, I have to give a thumbs up when we're all ready. Are you all ready? We're on that. Okay, it's lovely to be here today and lovely to be able to talk to you as well. I'm going to talk about historicizing energy transitions, historicizing accountability. And I thought because it's a bit of an odd take on this issue of accountability, I ought to give you an idea of where I'm coming from, academically speaking. I've been researching on urban infrastructures in transition in the past and the present for about the past 25 years. And initially, I'm a trained historian, actually. And so initially, I was working on historical stuff. And when I started my research, I found myself drawn in to the history in the making that was going on in Berlin and Germany in the 1990s. So I kind of lost my historical work, and I was doing social science work on contemporary urban transitions, drawing on a lot of STS material, but also a lot of really interesting debates going on in human geography to look at this really fascinating relationship between a city and its infrastructure. And it was only about 10 years ago that I rediscovered my historical roots. And I started looking at the history in particular of Berlin and its infrastructure history. And of course, when I was doing that, I was seeing it a different way because I'd done this research on contemporary transitions in the post-reunification thing. So when I was going into the archives, when I was reading documents, I was seeing things about the future and about the present that were very relevant, had been very relevant for me in the past research. So now I see myself very much as sort of working at the interface between urban studies, STS, and urban history. And I hope that I'm trying to, in my work that I'm doing now, trying to build a bridge between historical and contemporary perspectives on urban infrastructures in transition. And I should emphasize I'm not looking just at energy in the work I do. I will look at that today. I also look at water and sanitation as well. So I'm very interested, I guess this is the tie-in to what we're doing today, to the usable past, making history relevant to the present. And I think that's the link to what we're doing today. With my current research on Berlin, then I will come to the sort of meat of the topic, the core of the presentation, looking at historicizing accountability on Berlin's urban infrastructures from 1920 right the way up to the present. 1920 because that was the year that Greater Berlin was created, which was much, much bigger, as you will see, than the original tiny Berlin that existed beforehand. And in this book, basically, there are a number of innovations I'm trying to achieve here. One of them, the empirical innovations, partly is to tell Berlin's turbulent history through the lens of its infrastructures. Now, that's become quite a common meme in human geography now, in the so-called infrastructural turn, to tell the history of it, or tell a story of a city through the lens of its infrastructure. But what I'm doing is looking across this 100-year recent history, which crosses 5 very, very different political regimes, from the Weimar Republic, National Socialism, divided city with West Berlin, state socialist East Berlin, and reunification. So I'm telling that story, a history of Berlin, through the lens of how implications that had for the water and energy infrastructures. The second one, empirical innovation, is to apply a longue durée perspective on mature urban infrastructures. I emphasize the word mature here. A lot of historians of technology, urban historians, have looked at the emergence of infrastructure systems. Until they have become mature, which depends on which system you're looking at, will be some of the end of the 19th century, earlier 20th century in the case of electricity. Then they lose interest because it's mature, it's got established, they think nothing much is going on. And what we have now, a lot of people are looking at current configurations, many of you in the room today, and the knowledge of history is perhaps rather limited there. So my attempt is to bridge those two communities by looking at a long duration, 100-year period in one city to say what's happened after these systems became so-called established and mature. And the third one is to demonstrate how national and geopolitics influence urban infrastructure. Urban infrastructure studies has been criticized sometimes for fetishizing the city. So I'm trying to take urban infrastructure studies beyond the city, and Berlin is a beautiful example of that, because you cannot study Berlin's recent history without looking at the influence of national politics, geopolitics, international politics. So it's an interesting example of kind of exploding this notion of this fascination of the city as a bounded object. And the final one is to compare, if you are just looking at one city, why not look at several infrastructure cities and compare them, look at the resonances, the dissonances, the learning processes that are going on and so on between those. So I'm looking at electricity, at gas, at district heating, water and sanitation in the one city for that whole 100-year period. Now, there are conceptual contributions. I see myself contributing to concepts about urban infrastructures and developing what I'm calling a time-sensitive technological urbanism. And that's, on the one hand, it's basically about a more nuanced, a more relational notion of the temporalities and the spatialities of infrastructure. Okay, so in terms of the temporalities, it's about rethinking this relationship between continuity and change of infrastructure systems. Yeah, when we think of infrastructure systems, we often think of them as being very obdurate, very path-dependent. A lot of the research on infrastructure systems being about to demonstrate this path dependence of these systems. Once in place, very difficult to change. But there's another branch of research, very interested in the transitions, moments of change, yeah? Critical junctures, abrupt changes. And what I'm kind of interested in is neither of those really explains the Berlin case. Neither of them. Each of them explains parts of it, but none of them explain it altogether. I mean, if you look at the Berlin case, there's elements of change and non-change that are interacting all the time. That's what I'm getting at about a more nuanced understanding, a more layered approach to how the old and the new interact, because I think that's relevant for today. And the second one is about explicating this relationship between a city and its infrastructure. This is obviously very, very central to a lot of human geography, urban studies work at the moment, doing some really interesting work about, not just infrastructure serving the city, but how city politics, about how urban metabolic flows influence the kind of infrastructures that exist, the kind of infrastructures that are possible. Okay, so it's unpacking this notion of the urban and looking at the multiple urbans that are out there. It's not just about the bounded city, it's about urban politics, urban metabolisms, urban institutional cultures, and so on and so forth. But of course, also in terms of the spatialities as indicated, looking at the multi-scalar nature of the urban, how the urban is embroiled in lots of other scalar dimensions. And then there's, of course, methodological innovation behind this book project, because it's combining historical and social science methods, which is pretty obvious. It's taking the story up to the present day, and that's really important for me, as I indicated at the beginning, because a lot of historians, they keep a respectful distance to the present day, which might be 20 years, might be 30 years, and anything that gets too close to the modern day is, I'm out of my depth, yeah. And that's, for me, that's when the story gets interesting. This is where history gets relevant. It's looking at these legacies of the past and how they echo through into the present and the future, and trying to understand what they are, their limitations, but also the possibilities behind them. So it's about tracing these legacies in the past and the relevance for contemporary transitions today. So I hope that, although I'm talking from a historical perspective, that this kind of thing is interesting to our discussion today. Now, why Berlin? It's a question that's often asked, why Berlin? I think there's one obvious example, and there's one rather less obvious example that's perhaps more fundamental. And the obvious example, I think, has to do with the enduring allure of Berlin. It's attracting a lot of attention, has done for many, many decades. Yeah? Berlin is myth, model, and menetikel. Menetikel means an omen for impending doom. Yeah, okay. I had to use that because it began with M, of course. If you think of another better word that begins with M, that's fine. So there's, Berlin is the myth, all these eulogies in print about Berlin being the metropolis of Europe, as it was seen at the time owing to its strong electricity industry and so on, as the technological city through and through. That's James Joel. That was in the 1920s, the imagery of Berlin in the 1920s. If you look at the 1950s, this imagery of West Berlin as being a bulwark, a flagship of democracy in this sea of socialism, cut off from all the way around, standing up, this mythology of we can do it kind of thing. And then also visions of, perhaps less familiar, visions of a socialist urban modernity, which East Berlin in the GDR was expected to fulfill, and that very much at odds with everyday life in many ways. As a model, Berlin has been a model at many stages in its history, not just today. In the 1920s, it was really, there were lots of visitors from the States, from the UK, around Europe, visiting Berlin to visit its infrastructures, its power stations. It had gas storage facilities. It was using sewage gas for powering vehicles. All sorts of things were out there that were being visited. So it was a model, a positive model. Again, in West Berlin in the late 1980s and 1990s, was a model for a sort of environmental urbanism and early steps towards urban sustainability. Rather lost that last image as the 1990s wore on, but in the late 80s and early 90s, it very much was a model for sort of integrated urban development around sustainability ideals. And today, of course, Berlin, again, if you're looking at Berlin's infrastructure, has become a model for remunicipalization. And it's a model not because it's about a city regaining control of its infrastructures. That's the kind of traditional, conventional way of remunicipalization. This is a remunicipalization from below, which I'll be talking about more later on about accountability. This is about grassroots movements demanding a new form of municipal control, a new form of participation of the publics, of consumers in infrastructure management. Okay, and of course, finally, last not least, as a mini tickle, Berlin is the nerve center of National Socialism, a symbol of wartime destruction, and a victim of the Cold War divide. What did that mean in terms of infrastructure? How did those issues, how did those powerful changes manifest themselves in infrastructure systems? Or conversely, how did the infrastructures actually seek to support certain political regimes or resist, perhaps, certain political regimes at particular times? So Berlin is a mini tickle. The other argument about why Berlin, that was the obvious one, the less obvious one, where people say to me, well, that's great, Tim, and Berlin's really exciting and all that, but opacity, because its historical intensity and variety can point us to developments that are otherwise hidden from view in cities that are not experiencing that kind of turbulence. So this is what I'm writing. The very uniqueness of Berlin's crisis-ridden 20th century reveals dimensions to city infrastructure relations that are concealed elsewhere by the veil of routinized practices, institutionalized procedures, and taken for granted structures. So this is building on the idea of Jane Somerton that it's periods of crisis that reveal, or Jane Burnett, for example, periods of crisis that reveal dimensions to the governance of infrastructures, energy in particular, that you don't see otherwise. So a nice illustration of that coming out of my book, you might think, well, the moments of change will be then those when there's political disruption, and then you'll have most of the change to the infrastructure systems. Well, let me tell you, sneak preview, that is not the case. That is not the case. In fact, there is an argument to be made that the most extreme changes to infrastructure governance happened in the two single periods of relative normalcy in Berlin's history, which is the 1920s and the 1990s, and not during the periods where there was radical political disruption. So that's a kind of provocative thing I'd like to start with. Okay, so now, when is he going to start talking about accountability? Now. Moving on to the main part of the talk then, historicizing accountability. You realize what I'm trying to do with my book anyway is trying to look at the relevance of history for today. And so Sid has kind of posed us for the edited volume, this interesting idea. Can you reread your stuff? Can you reinterpret your empirical work in terms of accountability and practices of legitimation? So this has been a really interesting exercise. And I've kind of overemphasized perhaps the context of what I'm doing to emphasize that I am not a specialist in accountability. Okay, this is the first time I've been using this this concept in terms of interpreting this. So this is kind of being kind of interesting, as a caveat anyway, and that's kind of interesting exercise. So how can historicizing accountability contribute to our understanding of energy transitions and the ways of researching them? And I guess the idea is to sensitize scholarship on accountability and energy transitions to the importance of time and place. So the argument that we're basically coming away with is the idea that accountability is a political construct made at a particular time in a particular place. That's going to be the main arguments coming up what I'm doing. And how am I going to do this? I'm going to do this by... I could have selected, I was going to select some examples from Berlin's history. I could have selected some rather radical, undemocratic eras and explored accountability in National Socialism or even under state socialist system in East Germany. But I decided to go for examples which were for rather more democratic political regimes to perhaps enable a greater degree of comparability of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to pick sort of three eras which I think are relevant to the debate. And one is after the creation of Greater Berlin in the 1920s. And there's an issue about legitimacy, which is about distribution. In West Berlin between the 1950s and 80s, the issue of legitimacy around energy was about protection. And then the third period, which is about the reunited Berlin today, the issues around energy infrastructures today is very much about representation. So that gives you an indication of the changing kind of discourses around accountability going on. And following Sid's indications for us for the edited volume, I'm going to do it two steps. First of all, look at the crises of accountability, and then at practices of legitimation at work. And I'll do that for each of the three series. Okay, so here we go. Selected crises of accountability. The first one, the 1920s. And the crisis here was very much a crisis of urban fragmentation prior to the creation of Greater Berlin and its enactment in infrastructure systems. So, I told you West Berlin, where Berlin was very small before let's get this right. Hey, yeah. This is the Berlin we know today. Yeah, okay. In 1919, this was the size of Berlin. It was tiny, absolutely tiny. Yeah. Around here, there was another 7 cities, 59 communities, and I think 27 landed estates. And at that time, before 1920, all of these 7 cities, 59 communities, 27 landed estates had their own energy systems or contracts with others who were operating there. So you had a more or less uniform metropolitan area that was being served by an absolute mass of different electricity utilities, gas utilities, let alone the water and sanitation. So that was the crisis of urban fragmentation. And the law of Greater Berlin in 1920 was introduced to create a unitary city, unitary metropolitan, of a huge area, increased 12 times the size, became the second largest city in the world after Los Angeles in terms of geographical area. Okay, and the issue there was who'd be responsible for supplying energy to this rapidly growing metropolitan area. It led to this creation of Greater Berlin. And the aim was to create a single public utility for electricity and a single one for gas, serving the whole of the city. Now, this was partly done, of course, by taking on the existing municipal utilities. That was the relatively easy part. But there were also a number of private utilities that were providing gas and electricity at the time. And there was a long-standing fight to try and, whoops, let's go back. Let's get this right. This is the municipal utilities here with the vertically shaded stuff in 1925, but there still remained a number of privately served areas, and a sort of long-term attempt to try and unify the system, unify the city through infrastructure. Infrastructure as a tool for unification altogether. And the idea behind that was not simply a bureaucratic exercise, but it was to create unitary standards, unitary tariffs, and unitary forms of service altogether. Okay, let's take the second example. First of all, I'm looking at the crisis of accountability. The practices of legitimation come later, okay? The second example is, this is about accountability of beleaguered citizens, and it's basically the 1950s to the 1970s in West Berlin, okay? And what you see here is a map, a wonderful stylized map of Berlin in 1952. And you see the blockade had the effect of dividing off, you can see the cut electricity cables there, cut between East and West Berlin. The blockade led to a complete truncation of electricity supply between East and West. And even after the blockade was resolved, There was some cross-border supplies were done, but they became so unreliable, and West Berlin was so vulnerable to interruption that the West Berlin decided the answer to this is to go autark in electricity generation, to supply all of our own electricity in our own territory. So what you see here are a number of power stations being built in West Berlin. Altogether, 12 power stations were built in West Berlin over this period, and within a very short space of time, by the late 1950s, West Berlin was indeed autark with electricity. Also, incidentally, with town gas, produced all its own town gas, with imported coal, imported oil on these remaining sea routes that were coming, and rail routes that were coming in. Okay, so the strategy there was about urban energy autarky, self-reliance, and it was all in the idea of we are protecting the population. We need to do this because without electricity, this city would not function. That had been made very visible during the blockade. So that is the justification to build all these power plants up. Yeah. Now this compact, this kind of accountability deal that was never explicit between the population and the utility in the city, and the city became undermined in the 1970s. And it was undermined because of pressure from local residents and environmental groups about the massive amount of air pollution that was being created by this concentration of power generation and gas production. And when the city senate and the utilities came out and said, well, actually, we have 12 power stations already, but by 1990, we need another 12 within the half city of West Berlin, that's when alarm bells started ringing. Because the city government and the utilities assumed that they would simply be able to roll over this idea, because this argument about security was just killed everything, yeah? Killed all other arguments. They assumed they would go through. And it led to massive protests, as we'll see, which undermined this compact around this urban resilience strategy. But before we come to that, let's look at the third example, which is today. The crisis of accountability today is much about accountability to consumers and prosumers, yeah? There's a privatization in the 1990s of Berlin's electricity, gas, and also water utilities, and ownership and control of energy infrastructure re-emerged as a highly contested issue in the 2000, especially in the 2010s. As you may know, we've had referendum for the remunicipalized water utility. It was successful. There was a referendum for the municipalization of the electricity grid that was narrowly unsuccessful. This is a poster from the time, our municipal utility, our electric grid, our Berlin. Narrowly missed it, was not successful. Energy and will shortly take over control of the electric grid. And there are two grassroots initiatives that have been driving this, and one is the Berlin Energy Roundtable, which is a huge alliance of about 50 groups of environmental, anti-gentrification, and neighborhood groups working closely together, putting pressure on local politics. And the other is an energy cooperative called Citizens Energy Berlin, which is taking a different approach, has similar kind of objectives, taking a different organizational approach, trying to actually buy up enough shares to take over the electricity grid itself. Okay, so that's the kind of introduction to the first part, with looking at the crises of accountability that have been created there, because the crisis of accountability, in that latter one I should mention, is basically about, it's challenging this age-old notion of build and supply upon which the electricity utility and the gas utility also have relied for so long. Okay, look at these practices of legitimation at work. In the 1920s, the legitimation being used here was very much about creating uniform and affordable public services. And this was a very strong rationale behind the creation of Greater Berlin. So it wasn't just the case that Greater Berlin had enabled the infrastructure systems to be unified, but these infrastructure systems be used as instruments, as tools, to pursue that unification, that unitary, that social equity, you would say nowadays, that process going on across the city. And this was a very deliberate and very strategic policy decision of the city government, which I think is quite amazing at a time when Germany had just come out of a First World War and hyperinflation and so on. So what they were doing, the utilities were serving multiple functions. They were supposed not only to supply the energy, as one expected, but they were supposed to minimize burdens on consumers. They were supposed to support the local economy in terms of with the contracts they were negotiating. They were also supposed to support the city budget with lots of cross-subsidies became absolutely crucial during the Great Depression in 1929-32, hugely dependent on these utilities. So, and these arguments were used as justification for massive investments. You can see here the power station of Klingenberg, built in 1928-29, was at the time the most modern power station in Europe. And in the late 1920s, this legitimacy of welfare expansionism, as I've called it, so it's expansionism, but it was all closely associated with the benefits for the population of Greater Berlin. This idea of social equity is very powerful. It became challenged on the left and the right. The left, the Communist Party, were criticizing these increases in tariffs that were necessary to keep the city budget balanced and these kind of things. But in particular, that was far less important. The criticism was coming from the far right and bourgeois parties, who were trying to undermine this municipal socialism or this municipal efforts by criticizing, in particular, the foreign loans that were taken on board, particularly from the United States, that were being paid entirely by these utilities, paid entirely by them without any subsidies. But they were criticizing them because they knew if they could undermine that effort, they could get at them. And in fact, it led ultimately to the privatization of the power utility in Berlin, BEWAG, in 1931. And the parallels of that to the privatization of the Berlin power utility, BEWAG, in 1997 are absolutely stunning. It's as if somebody had read the historical documents and said, that's how we're going to do it. But that's another story. You have to read the book. Hang on. Yeah, okay, 1950s, 1970s. This was obviously the arguments of legitimacy here was about providing energy security in an insular city. That was the argument, yeah? The lights, they literally said the lights will go off if we don't build these power stations. Yeah, business will go, terrified of business going away, because that apparently was what the socialists were dreaming of, squeezing West Berlin to death. So it would just sort of dry out, basically. All the people would go, and then you'd just take it over, So energy security was legitimizing urban energy autarky once again with a network expansion. Of course, cost didn't play any huge role in West Berlin, never did, because you just paid the tab, passed the tab on to Bonn, and Bonn said, well, okay, we'll just pay the bill. So costs were never a really big issue. You could justify it that way. What did become the issue, as I say, was these practices were being challenged over to air pollution, landscape degradation, and critique of expansionist consumerist models. And there was a very controversial issue in 1976, where one of these power stations, big power stations, 600 megawatts, was going to be built in the city, in this place called Spandau. And there were massive protests of this that became very well organized, building also, of course, on the anti-nuclear movement, the kind of actions going on there. And not only were they challenging the siting of these power plants, they were challenging the very notion that we need them, and that we need them for our security. So it was undermining this compact that had been developed about accountability, and they were challenging the accountability of the utility and the city government to actually claim that this was the only solution. And indeed, academics were highly involved in this, proving that there were alternatives. Yeah, it was an important role for academics, particularly at the Free University of Berlin. Yeah, and they were very, very active in persuading the way. Here we have a tree camp, which has amazing. Those of you who have seen the Hambacher Force protests, you think that was a photo of that, but it isn't. It's 1976 in the forest there. So using alternative technologies to delegitimize the incumbent's role, saying that we do have alternatives to what was going on there. And the final one, practices of legitimation at work. What we're seeing now is a kind of contestation of two discourses of legitimacy between the incumbents on the one hand and the social movements on the other. And it's about technical expertise on the one hand and global sustainability on the other. And I'm sure this is very familiar to the kind of work you're doing. So whereas the incumbent power and gas utilities, that's now Vattenfall as it now is, Vattenfall Europe for power, and Gazag, a privatized gas utility for gas, presenting themselves as the experts. We have the technical expertise, we have the history behind us, we have the track record, we have the financial viability. Don't give the grid to these amateurs here. It's lovely. They have lovely ideas, but don't give it to them because it's just be a disaster. Whereas the social movement say it's actually a disaster as it is. We can't move with these organizations. They're the disaster. So campaigning, and they're actually campaigning, and this is important for this workshop, for an accountable municipalization. They're not satisfied with just saying the city should have it back, end of story. They say, no, we don't want that old style municipal utility. It was almost as bad as, the privatized versions, because it isn't really accountable after all. So they're calling for a more institutionalized influence for users, for consumers, for environmental groups as part of the decision-making process of the utility. Yeah, and there's a lot of debate about how that should work out and who should be represented and blah, blah, as you can imagine. Highly contested, in addition, of course, to environmental sustainability, social equity, and issues of participation. And this is a poster of the Berlin Stadtwerk that's been created by the city, a very small municipal utility being created by the city in competition to Vattenfall Europe and Gazag, yeah, that have their own roots in the city, under from the pressure from social movements altogether. Quite amazing that's actually happened. So let me come to my concluding remarks, which is, have I got 5 minutes? Yeah. To my concluding remarks, and this title that Sid's given us of Interventions for Sustainable Outcomes is difficult for a historian. So I have to mention this caveat first of all, because when we talk about sustainability in history, of course, the word sustainability, the concept of sustainability has not been, in the way we use it today, has only been common parlance since the 1980s. So a lot of the periods I'm talking about, where they're not talking about sustainability as we now understand it, or as many people now understand it. It is problematic as a historian to look at sustainability issues. I will say a bit about that, but I think the idea about historicizing accountability is something which I can say much more about, which is more relevance. And the first point I want to make is crises of accountability over energy are not new. Now that may seem very obvious, but it's very, very important to appreciate that. These crises of accountability I've observed, other people have observed, happen in periods of emergence of energy systems, in periods of consolidation of energy systems, but also in periods of reconfiguration or adaptation of these systems. All these systems have different kinds of crises. So looking at past instances can help contextualize the present. Looking at critical junctures, where the hegemony that people were talking about just before the break now about neoliberalism were challenged, perhaps successfully, perhaps unsuccessfully. You can learn from both. Second point, what accountability can mean, how it is invoked, to what ends, and by what means, varies hugely in time and space. So history is telling us that accountability is a situated political construct. Yeah. History can help us appreciate the diversity of accountability rules, the rules of accountability. Reading through some of your texts, it's almost like, it's obvious what the rules of accountability are, because we're talking about them, but they can change rapidly, from era to era, to country. But also, of course, the variety of different countries and different cities and different areas that are being respected, because, we'll get a different sensitivity to that. But what I'm trying to argue is may not survive very long if the discourses change or the physical circumstances change or whatever, or the political context. So future-proofing these things, to use that word, it perhaps will be necessary altogether. And as I say, today's accountability fix, which we're all very happy with, might turn out to be tomorrow's accountability trap if we're not sensitive to those kind of changes. And fourthly, processes of legitimizing energy transition are inextricably bound up in wider societal concerns. And I've used this example of Berlin to show how issues of accountability get embroiled in notions of, for example, creating a unitary city. So this kind of redistributive notion about what a city is about was very formative in the way that energy infrastructures were pursued in the 1920s, or about protecting the cities and the security issue around West Berlin. That was hugely informative in the 1950s. And then, of course, as I talk about now, this idea of representation, who is represented, who has a voice, and in what way, is very, very important. It's reflective of city politics in Berlin at the moment. It's working its way through infrastructure systems. So we need to heed, enroll, or resist concurrent movements likely to influence the viability of a preferred pathway. And this brings me to my final point, which is that sustainability thinking and practice may be new in the way we're understanding it today, but they do have their historical roots. There are component parts of what we call sustainability today that have very, very interesting historical roots that are often overlooked, often discarded. So past efforts to save energy, past efforts to manage demand, I've written a paper about demand side management in managing urban energy in Berlin, right the way through from the 1920s to the present day. And it's amazing what was going on in the 20s and 30s and the way of trying to manage demand and understand what demand management is. Ways of using renewables, all sorts of interesting issues about, as I mentioned, sewage gas being used as a fuel, and also electricity for powering vehicles and so on. And challenging supply side logics. That example I drew for from the 1970s, the idea of challenging the supply side logic, very, very important in maybe inspiring us or warning us against what might go wrong. So that's kind of the end of my talk, and the book will be coming out, unfortunately, in about a year's time, hopefully, with this title, working title, and with MIT Press. However, if you want to learn a bit more about this, I do have a film that has been made about the book, which has been a wonderful experience. That's been funded by the foundation that has generously funded my book, called the Gerda Henkel Foundation, and it's a film of 6 short episodes that will be free online, probably next month. Plus an interview with me talking about that. So if you're interested in these kind of things and interested in seeing Berlin's undergrounds, because we go to all sorts of interesting places, then do follow that up on this link, because it's not out there yet. It'll be in English and German. And then finally, here's some other related publications, both to my contemporary research and also my historical research on Berlin. So I'll leave you to that. Thank you.
Can you hear it now? Yes. Thank you, Tim. I'm going to keep my remarks extremely short because I think it's everyone else's privilege to be able to pose questions and offer comments to your wonderful talk. I just want to say it's been an absolute education, and I'm very grateful to you for having taken up the challenge and made something really beautifully rigorous and compelling out of it. So I don't have anything to say right now, but anybody who'd like to ask a question or offer a comment, please come up here and do it off of this mic.
Just going back to the slide with the film on it. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you to elaborate a bit more on 2 moments where listening, I intuitively nod my head and agree, but then rethinking, I would like you to explain more what you mean. And those 2 things were about learning from this historical analysis. The first one was in the beginning when you said Berlin is an extraordinary case. It's so different from everything else. Normally you would say there can't be much lessons drawn from it, but then you pointed to what this crisis and extraordinary situation does reveal. Can you say a bit more on that? And the second one was number 1 of your conclusions. Maybe you can go back to... Right. Yeah, similar argument. Looking at the past can help contextualize the present. Intuitively, yes, of course, always. But what exactly do you mean?
Thank you. That was very interesting. On that first issue as well, all right, we can learn from the past, but do these campaigners learn from the past? That's something that I was thinking about. And then second, also about contemporary re-municipalization and bottom-up grassroots movements. How are they linked, these energy campaigners and this energy movement, with other bottom-up movements in Berlin concerned with urban issues, for example, with capping rents for people that rent houses, rent apartments, etc. And so, how are there any linkages? Do they learn from each other on how to organize, how to build movements, etc. In contemporary Berlin?
Okay, that's mine. Can I?
Mine relates to that.
Great.
So I was thinking about that last issue in relation to elitism, some of the conversations that came up yesterday. So thinking about contemporary Berlin movements and if they're disjunctures with the movements that want more renewable energy and then also the squatting kind of anti-gentrification movements, and if there are moments where they actually come together and have a common platform, or if the kind of ultimate goals are so fundamentally different that they don't necessarily have a common vocabulary.
Okay, can I work backwards with those ones? Yeah. I think in terms of these ideas of these energy movements and where they're coming from, I mentioned this energy roundtable Berlin comprises not only environmental groups but also anti-gentrification groups, and it is probably quite extraordinary how it has created an alliance that has more or less stayed together quite well since its creation in 2010, I think it was, and it learnt itself emerged from the example of the water sector. And the water sector emerged from a water roundtable Berlin, same kind of name, same kind of idea with alliance that was successful with the referendum. So we do have a remunicipalized water utility now. However, the water roundtable, I think there are now 3 of them. Yeah. So this idea of conflicts going on within this group has emerged. Now, it would be lovely to study those 2 organizations, say, why is it, it worked, it was successful with the referendum with water, but it was, unsuccessful with the energy one with the referendum. But in terms of the sort of stability of these groups and the way they work together, it's the other way around, That would be very interesting to explore that in some detail. I think part of the answer may be in that there are actually these two energy groups. One is this alliance, which is rather more critical. It's drawing very strongly on the sort of the realist agenda and the sort of social housing, or the sort of housing dilemma that's going on in Berlin. They don't see that. The other group is this energy cooperative. So it's kind of, they learn from the past, these groups. I would say no, there's very, very little learning from the past game. I mean, I would say that because that's, that's the game I'm in. But indeed, I mean, it's not just me saying that, but there's some important people from the city government in Berlin who were very instrumental in the early 1990s in pushing through what was then very progressive energy policies at a city level. It kind of fell off the agenda later. They are setting up a project called Gedächtnis-Energiewende, which means, doesn't translate as the memory of the energy transition. And they are reacting against the notion that the energy transition is something happening right now, that there's no roots to it. And they're trying to say, God, we went through this. We're retired now, we went through this. We know the kind of discussions, it's not exactly the same, of course. And they're trying to reactivate knowledge about this period in particular in the 1980s, early 1990s, when a lot of these debates were coming out, and the kind of contests that were going on, the kind of ideas that were going on, the lessons that were learnt. So it'd be very interesting to see if this project managed to take off and it gets funding and stuff. But so there is an interest. It's being perceived not only by people like me, but also by people in the field who have retired and are looking in frustration at what's going on altogether. And in terms of, cutting what you were talking about, the past and the present, how can the past speak to the present? That's a brilliant idea, the Gedächtnis-Energiewende, it's amazing how some of the people, even in Germany now, think, it only began after Fukushima, that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of things that predate that, and I would say, I would say, look beyond the 1980s. There are very interesting experiments in demand-side management that were coming from the 1920s and 1930s that perhaps reveal, because they were being talked about the first time so in a very naked way, some of the dynamics that were going on and some of the difficulties were encountered. But the question is, of course, of getting that mobilized, and this usable past is something that I think is really, really important, and I don't see many people doing it, really. And I'm in terms of my future projects, I would love to do, I have this idea for a project, of doing a project on Berlin, which is speaking using these histories that I've been researching to speak to decision makers now, to speak to users, energy users, to these energy roundtables, to discuss together with them how this history could be made more mobile and how it could be used or maybe not used, and discovering some bits that are pretty irrelevant, you know. Does that kind of give you a sort of answer to that question? About the revelatory, yes, the revelatory bit about Berlin. That was the other part of your question. Was the last bit before I stopped talking. I think it's. I mean, what I would love to know if people went away and think, wow, that's an interesting idea. If they read this book and say, actually, perhaps there is something about that in my own city. I haven't seen it because it's not so visible, you know. But if I scratch the surface a bit more, there may be some of those phenomena that Tim was talking about in Berlin. But in Berlin, it's just so much in your face that you can't ignore it, because it's been revealed, it's been discussed, it's been contested in many different ways. It reveals, it comes out of the earth, you know, and stares at you, and you can't ignore it. Whereas for many other cities, it might still be under the surface and covered up. Yeah, and so if I manage to stimulate some people to go back to their own cities and say, or regions or countries or whatever, and say, wow, that's an interesting idea. Did that exist in my place as well? Was that being discussed? These kind of alternative technologies and so on, and who was discussing them? You know, I think that's what I'm trying to get at. Yeah. I think, yeah. Oops.
I'm going to try to be quick and concise with something that's maybe not concise in my head. But my question is about historical interpretations of accountability and how those change over time, and democracy. Because intuitively, I understand accountability, and especially what we're seeing now is responding to failures in democracy to represent social interest. And so the types of engagement people are demanding are very different than, say, just a vote in an election, where they trust that decisions will be made in their interest. And so I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to that idea in the context of Berlin specifically, but also other places in the world, if you can expand or generalize beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
The previous question had framed accountability as a process of holding actors to provide and respond to public purposes or public interests, and that's fine. I'll offer a slightly more general one, which is simply accountability as a capacity to create follow-through where actors actually deliver what it is they have pledged to deliver, whatever that may be. And so my question is, across these 5 or so different infrastructures or sectors, and across the historical periods in which you were examining, did you see any kind of constellations and context in which accountability was realized more effectively than others? So if we think it's a hyper-applied question, it's basically what works for accountability? And to answer that, you may have to define accountability.
I'm deliberately keeping this open, this idea of defining accountability, because, I mean, the essential point I'm making is it's a political construct. So it changes from time to time. And I was thinking through, when I was thinking through this chapter in the book, and I thought, what would accountability mean in National Socialism? Yeah. And I thought, well, to be honest, it was probably the people are accountable to the Fuhrer. That's how they would define it. That's how the regime would have defined that. It's completely turning it on its head. Yeah? It's not about the government being responsible to the people at all. It's about the people being responsible to the Fuhrer. Yeah? If you think about state socialism, yeah, you have the Socialist Unity Party basically defining itself as representing all the interests of the working class, and it was a working class state. That was the definition of the state, the workers and farmers state. So accountability was automatic, because it defined that it is the sole and only voice of the working class. Yeah. So I mean, I didn't give those examples here because it sort of explodes this notion of accountability. But what we're talking about here is very much today's notion of accountability. It's really, really justifiable, and there are evidence. And I could trace that notion, the notions we're talking about accountability now, and back in history and look at the kinds of things that you're talking about. You know, where are the eras where there was that kind of responsibility? And I guess I would always come back to periods like, I think, and we're definitely seeing it now in Berlin. And it's creating a lot of challenges to both the utilities and the city government. You know, a city government being forced to municipalize. It was arguing against it beforehand, being forced by popular movements to do that, and it's raising all sorts of issues about who's actually in control there, who's doing this for whom, and whose interest. And they're doing it because it was much more than just providing basic services. But I see it also in terms of, I think very strongly in the 1920s. I have huge respect. I mean, not everything that was going on there was great in the 1920s, but it was certainly a period where this was this sense of we're doing this for all Berliners. I mean, never mind what was going outside Berlin. That was the problem. They didn't think of them at all. It was about Berlin, these new Berliners, what we're doing. We're accountable for them. We need to provide them with good basic services that are affordable and that are manageable. And we need control of this. It was very much about municipal control at all. They were resisting tooth and nail attempts by the Reichselektrowerke, Preußen Elektra, and all these national utilities, Ruhrgas and all the rest, were trying to provide Berlin, saying, you know, great market and all the rest. They resisted them tooth and nail very successfully until the Nazis came. Yeah, and that was very much about drawing this line around the city and saying, we're accountable to these people. We want to make sure the utilities are as well. So that was it's pretty impressive, I think, there. So if I'm looking back to a period of examples of seeing it in an integrated way, accountable, also these utilities accountable for other policy fields, accountable for social welfare, accountable for fiscal stability, for economic development, and so on. And there was a different agenda to accountability, what you're getting at, than what we normally associate with, you know, energy services, just providing, electricity for everybody at affordable prices.
Yeah, so thank you for that. I just think that, you know, the historians take the empirics very seriously, and if we think about energy transitions or transitions in environment, maybe now's not the time, given we have other folks who want to get a word in, but I think it's a very rich opportunity to think about how accountability can be frustrated or perhaps achieved in relation to different definitions that you've talked about across these different material sectors, which is a very exciting intellectual and analytical project.
I think that's really powerful as well, because even spatially, these different sectors have very different spatial reaches. And by defining electricity generation and gas generation in a very localized way, you develop notions of accountability, which for water is much different, because water is much more of a local resource, and sanitation as well. Sorry. I haven't really responded to your question, have I yet, really, which was about accountability and democracy, yeah? It'd be quite good to just elaborate on that, because I kind of lost my track there, I'm afraid. Sorry.
It's basically that the accountability mechanisms that exist at a specific time seem to respond to the extent to which, or as a proposition, respond to the extent to which the democratic system or the system of government is meeting what people think is important. And whether you've seen that in the context of Berlin over time or in other contexts.
Yeah. I mean, sticking to Berlin, sorry, I forgot the question, but I think that's a really good point. And I think it's perhaps best illustrated in this West Berlin case, where there was this sense of accountability that was successfully pursued about the security notion in the 50s. That was really, really stable. I find no protest whatsoever against building these first 12 power stations, which, you know, okay, but not 12, another 6 or 7 were built in that period. But there were no protests at all, because people, you know, the blockade experience was so real and so recent that nobody was confronting that. But as the 60s wore on, and particularly in the 70s, that's when it crumbled. It began to crumble. Of course, it had a lot to do with détente and the idea that there was a possibility to reach out, you know, to the enemy and you know, import gas and electricity in from outside, from the Soviet Union or whatever. So there's the geopolitics at play there. But it had a lot to do with the internal politics and this idea that West Berlin had become really kind of cocoon culture. There was a closed shop, yeah? And part of the media fascination with those protests was that it was really cutting against that closed shop of a highly incestuous political system that West Berlin had become hugely dependent on external aid and all the rest, you know. So that, yes, thank you for asking that question, because it's got me thinking about that. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Susanne Urban. I'm an architect and town planner in Bergen. Thank you for the lecture. If I understand you right, you have one main axis where you see the fluctuation between municipality and privatization. And then I wonder if there isn't another axis too, and that's about sustainability and digitalization as a game changer. And I say that because when we talk about sustainability today, I can quote Greta Thunberg talking about "you're stealing our future." We are accountable to the next generation, and this is maybe something new when we study history. Mm-hmm. And this thing of centralization and makes things very vulnerable. So when I think about town planning in all these different systems, electricity, whatever, I see that it would be very good to decentralize, because if you hack yourself into the municipality's data system today, you stop everything, because also water stops if electricity is stopped. So I wonder if you see this axis, which is kind of crossing the democratic axis. Thank you.
Okay.
A completely different perspective, talking as a practitioner right now, because as I said, I have 2 feet, and right now I'm representing this association, the Swiss association, where all these Stadtwerke are represented. And right now, or I think for 10 years now, they're discussing about a full liberalization of the electricity market. As I'm saying, they're still discussing, so it's not yet fully liberalized. And so I was wondering, during my PhD, I studied exactly these urban utility companies in Germany and Switzerland. And so the presentation was just mind-blowing for me and really supporting what I did too. But then, as a practitioner right now, how can I speak to those people, and what might be a lesson learned which I can bring back home to prevent that they're doing exactly the same mistakes? So what might be a lesson learned which I could bring back to Switzerland to say, okay, look, guys, listen to history.
Okay, that's a great invitation, isn't it? For a historian talking about the usable past. Thank you. I'll start with that one. I think that's. I think one of the lessons coming out, 'cause I do sort of toy around with this idea of municipalization and seeing how that's been reframed throughout the decades of Berlin's last history is really fascinating. So municipalization is not always what we think it is. Yeah, it was used as part of a program to create a Greater Berlin, which is perhaps a conventional kind of municipalization that you're thinking about. It was used, interestingly, by the Nazis. And the idea there was to remove foreign ownership from the utilities and to remove Jewish ownership from the utilities. And they'd call that municipalization. Yeah. It was used after the war as well in a rather different way. And it was used after reunification, of course, as a kind of way of undermining state socialism and setting it on a new sort of federal government line. And what we're seeing now with these new movements, as I say in my talk, this kind of remunicipalization is very different to what was being practiced in the past. This is not just about municipal ownership, full stop. It's about enriching, it's about using, and it's about institutionalizing certain goals and objectives and visions and methods and techniques into a municipal utility that prevents it becoming lethargic and build and supply and all the rest. So look at what my lesson would be, look at what these movements have gone. Look at the fact, just unpack this notion of municipalization as being something that's been black boxed, and we all know what it means. And it's just about the ownership of a utility, full stop. Unpack that completely. There are interesting contemporary developments which are just exploding that notion. And there are also interesting historical examples that have used municipalization in very different ways. So if you look at those, you get an idea of the variety, and just getting people to think about the variety of municipalization. It is not just about the ownership. I'm not saying the ownership issue is unimportant. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not arguing against municipalization, but I'm saying that is not enough. And the German examples are excellent to show that there are serious limitations to just putting these things in municipal control. And this notion of the loss of that legacy of what purposes municipal uses really could be put to, which was demonstrated so clearly in the 1920s, this variety of functions they had for social policy, for economic policy, for fiscal policies, in addition to providing the basic services and all the rest, is something that they were so well aware in the 1920s in this period of emergence, and has kind of got lost now, you know? If we talk about cross-subsidies now, so, oh, no, cross-subsidies, you know, panic, you know, but that was completely normal, you know. Even the right-wingers in the 1930s didn't criticize them for cross-subsidization. So in terms of the sort of next generation and what's going on, I think infrastructure is interesting because it's also, somebody mentioned this yesterday, it's also it's obviously a long-term issue, the long-term planning needed for infrastructures. If you build infrastructures, you know you're planning for 20, 30, 40 years, so you're setting this path dependency and forth. And so there has always been a kind of visioning has been very powerful with infrastructures, even with your hardline engineer infrastructure planner has been very familiar with that. And I've encountered all sorts of amazing statistics that have been enrolled to justify, you know, massive new power stations, massive new water treatment plants, and God knows what else. Berlin was meant to have a population of 20 million by now. 20 million, yeah, according to some of the prognoses that were going in the 1920s. You know, so they were thinking, wow, this is great. You need to build these big, you know, power stations, all the rest. So the idea of thinking in the future is very much, but in a very different way, that we're talking about that, you know, today in terms of the climate crisis. Because that was very much about the future of our system, of our physical systems, and how it needs to be supported, and extrapolating our demand from the existing pressure. It's a very different way of thinking futures. So looking at past visionaries, sort of past socio-technical imaginaries, if you like, past ones, I think is very interesting to criticize the way that we're looking at current ones. And in some of them, it's, you know, you can just only say we're really, really grateful they haven't been enacted, you know, because it would be the viability of life on Earth for current generations. That is a ball changer. Perhaps was the problem, because it was all local power production in West Berlin. And the environmentalists were asking for a more regional, a more national, a more geopolitical solution that was bigger, that involved using more renewables and importing more electricity and minimizing the need to generate electricity locally. So that's, I'm not saying you should generalize from that. What I'm just saying is it should sensitize us to this notion that decentralization is not always good and does create some problems there. And these kind of historical examples, great, they irritate, they provoke you to think in a rather different way about decentralization.
Thanks so much, Tim. I think we should have a round of applause for fantastic talk. And with that, we have about 40 minutes for lunch. There's sandwiches here. I recommend taking